Hello, hello, hello. So many wonderful, familiar names that I can see in this space. Welcome to the New Mexico Black Leadership Council's Afro Futurism Lecture Series. This event is part of the 10th annual New Mexico Black History Festival. This year, as you can tell, we're celebrating Black history year round. Here in March, of course, during Women's History Month, we are very excited to bring you a series that centers Black women. Thank you again for being here. And special thanks to our partner, University of New Mexico African American Student Services, for assisting us in spreading the word about this series. My name is Shauna Brown. That's a very Afro-futuristic photo of myself. I am the Deputy Director of New Mexico Black Leadership Council and the Black History Festival Project Lead. The New Mexico Black Leadership Council serves as a hub to create a viable and sustainable social profit sector here in New Mexico. I want to recognize that our building is located on indigenous unceded Tiwa land in what is known as Albuquerque, New Mexico. Our services and programs focus on 5 key areas, which you can see on your screen: civic engagement, health, leadership development, positive youth development, and cultural vibrancy. Cultural vibrancy is a part of what we're doing with this particular session. Now, before we dig in too deep, I recognize that here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, it is 4 p.m. Mountain, and even later for folks who are joining us from other places. And I know that you probably had work and school and general life obligations that had to be met. So many different things required your attention, but yet you made it here. And as a thank you, I'd like to offer you a precious, precious moment to reset and recenter, okay? It's gonna be easy, should be. All we're gonna do is breathe, but together and with intention. So, if you feel called, drop your shoulders a little bit, drop your jaw, right? All the tension that we carry. And join me in this collective deep breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. Feel better? Just a little bit? I hope so. Thank you for showing yourself a little bit of care. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for celebrating Black History and Women's History Month with us right now. Now, enough of me. It's time that we get right into it. Let me introduce you to Dr. Finney Coleman, who is our moderator of our lecture series. Dr. Coleman is president of the Faculty Senate at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches courses in African American literature, history, and culture. Welcome, Dr. Finney Coleman.
Thank you, Shauna. Welcome everyone to Afrofuturism, from our screens to reality. In this 3-part lecture series, we will discuss what a new generation of Black women superheroes has looked like through the lens of Afrofuturism. In the coming weeks, we'll be joined by Virginia Commonwealth University's Dr. Kimberly Brown, who will discuss Watchmen and the character Angela Abar, AKA Sister Night, played by Regina King. We will conclude the series with our very own Dr. Andrea Mays, who's actually on with us today. Dr. Mays is going to present on Janelle Monáe's motion picture, Dirty Computer. We begin our series this afternoon with Lovecraft Country and my dear, dear friend and colleague, Dr. Belinda Deenen Wallace. Dr. Wallace is an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico in the Department of English, Language, and Literature, where she teaches courses in Afrofuturism, contemporary Caribbean literature and culture, Afro-diaspora and Afro-Latinx studies, post-colonial literatures, and women, gender, and sexual studies. Her research is rooted in intersectionality, and her writings have appeared in Cultural Dynamics, Journal of Canadian Studies, Women, Gender, and Families of Color, and Proud Flesh, New African Journal of Culture, Politics, and Consciousness. Recently, Dr. Wallace was invited by Oxford University to write an essay on Afrofuturism. Please look for that essay in the coming months. That's an important contribution to the scholarship on Afrofuturism. She also has 2 special issues forthcoming. The first centers on teaching Afrofuturism during COVID-19, while the second investigates Black queer subjectivity in the films Watermelon Woman and Moonlight. Dr. Wallace is presently completing her first manuscript, which queers literary reimaginings of Caribbean slave rebellions, political revolutions, and social cultural resistance movements through an examination of historiographic metafiction. Welcome, Dr. Wallace. How are you this afternoon?
I am doing quite well. Thank you, Dr. Coleman, for that introduction. Wonderful introduction. How are you this evening?
I'm doing well. We're going to have a good time this afternoon. Hey,
I think so.
You know, to get started, we have, before we start your lecture, we have this opening query that we want to ask. Actually, everyone who's in the audience, if you don't mind, and unless it crashes our system, go ahead and turn your cameras on so we can kind of put some faces to names if you don't mind. Some of you aren't able to do that, I understand, but those of you who can or are willing to do that, it's a lot easier to present when you can see who you're presenting to. So we want you to participate in this lecture. We're going to start by asking you kind of a fun question. We want to give you the opportunity to go into the chat. You'll find a link there in the chat that'll give you a link that you can click on to participate in the query, or you can simply scan the QR code that's on the screen in front of you now, right? The question is simply this: if you were to give someone else, not yourself, but you were to give someone else a superpower, what would that superpower be, and why would you give it to that person? And we'll look for, if we can see, let's see if we can have our chats up so that we can see how people are responding to that.
Okay.
My kids need 10 plus 10 agility so they don't bump into stuff and knock things over. I like that.
Yeah, I like that one.
Undeniability as
oh,
a
wow.
hero, as a superpower.
Yeah, but you already know. That is fierce.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, wow, yeah. I always like the teleportation. I'm not too big on flying. I'd rather just get there, yeah.
And that one's really generous because usually we give ourselves crazy powers, but when you have to give it to someone else, people get real stingy. And so, which is why I really love this question. There's some generous answers here.
Yeah.
Healing heart, I like that. Some kindness. I like this group.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you know, let's take just a moment to kind of talk about this as a kind of a prelude to your talk, Belinda. I mean, of the ones that you see here, I mean, I really like that one about undeniability, right? That you wouldn't be denied anything. That's a remarkable superpower to have.
Especially as a gift. I like that one a lot. I saw someone said something about empathy when I mentioned Parable of the Sower in my talk, and that character is an empathic person. And so I like when we can relate to one another's humanity. So that's cool. A lot of kindness and healing as well.
Yeah, I mean, often we kind of think of, when we talk about a superpower, I think there's a tendency to gender that as a notion as to what that means, and to kind of focus on like masculine strength or physical strength. But the true powers that are the true power that we have as human beings, I think that are super, are the ones that are showing up on the screen here: fierce compassion, discernment.
Softened heart. Someone was giving a parent who works 3 jobs the ability to be in 3 places at once, or an extra day off. I think as that parent, I'd want the extra day off, right? As the superpower. And so there's definitely a lot of outward looking approach to these responses.
So thanks everyone for contributing that. Sometimes we don't want to play along. Sometimes we don't feel like dreaming out loud. So thank you for getting in the spirit of the lecture. And yes, I'd love to continue with this, but I can't wait to hear your presentation, Dr. Wallace, Belinda, on seeing Africa in Afrofuturism, Hippolyta, naming, and Lovecraft Country. Now, Hippolyta, what's the problem with the name there? Is there?
Well, we're going to find out, right? There may be a problem, there may not. So first of all, let me do a bit of housekeeping and some welcoming. So first and foremost, I want to welcome all of you here this evening. In the words of that great American philosopher, Jay-Z, you could be anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with me, and I appreciate that. So welcome to my presentation, Seeing Africa and Afrofuturism, Hippolyta, Naming, in Lovecraft Country. Okay, let me see if I can get control. There we go. So first, let me thank Ms. Catherine McGill, Ms. Shauna Brown, Ms. Kendra Hill, Ms. Tanya Bryant, and Mr. Mason Graham, and the entire New Mexico Black Leadership Council team. Ms. McGill, thank you so much for your generosity, your leadership, and this invitation to participate tonight. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you to the New Mexico Black Leadership Council team for all your hard work. People behind the scenes are so important, and I greatly appreciate all of your support. And also thank you, Dr. Finney Coleman. You share my love of Afrofuturism and the possibilities embedded therein. Thank you for bringing this program to fruition. I am honored to be here with you this evening and with all of you. And again, thank you to our audience for joining us. So, actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me lay some groundwork here first and give you an idea of how this presentation is going to unfold. So I begin by sharing my personal journey into Afrofuturism. That was the slide I skipped ahead to just a moment ago. From there, I move into a bit of grounding where I offer working definitions of Afrofuturism and African futurism. And then I move into the meat of my talk, where I situate my analysis on Hippolyta as a hieroglyphic exploration. And I will explain what I mean by that. But first, how did I get here? I'm going to stick to the pages, so I stick to my time. My first step into Afrofuturism happened when I was a college student, and I was introduced to the Nigerian author Amos Tutoa's first novel, The Palm Wine Drinker. This book is mislabeled as folklore and is too often reduced to a fable about a drunkard so desperate for a drink, he goes off in search of his dead winemaker, his vintner. In actuality, The Palm Wine Drinker is a futuristic odyssey of a young boy's journey into the supernatural world in search of self, knowledge, and power. For me, The Palm Wine Drinker was a journey into the past, as it presented an Africa I never knew, a continent that wasn't filtered through a colonial and imperialist lens. In this way, it also represented the future, a world where Blackness was unapologetically centered. My next step into Afrofuturism was via African-American author Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower. Amidst a dystopic backdrop of despair, Parable is a story that follows a hyper-empathic adolescent girl who creates a new spirituality called Earthseed, many of us know this, and builds a new community of hope called Acorn. In Butler's protagonist, I saw myself and my world reflected. For many of us who grew up in times of want and poverty, dystopia was right around the corner, constantly threatening to encroach upon our worlds. So it took very little imagination for me to enter and understand Butler's novel. My third step into Afrofuturism was through Caribbean speculative fiction author Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber, which could easily be called The Adventures of Tan-Tan. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. Midnight Robber features a young girl on the verge of womanhood who runs away from her home planet and starts a revolution on her adopted planet aptly called Tucson. The novel concludes with Tan-Tan giving birth to a son whom she names Tubman, intimating that her revolutionary legacy will continue. Hopkinson's novel, which evokes places and artifacts from Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean, is a reminder that my journey to Afrofuturism has always already been diasporic. So I was introduced to Afrofuturism by Amos Tutoa. I was influenced by Afrofuturism in large part due to Octavia Butler, and my worldview was certainly informed by Afrofuturism via Nalo Hopkinson. However, it is through my then 7-year-old niece, Afrofuturistic story, Belle Saves the World, that I became transformed by Afrofuturism. Young Belle is a vigilante out for justice. protecting the weak and keeping the world safe from bullies and bad guys. Belle's world is comprised exclusively of little black and brown girls and boys. In her excitement, my niece shared her newly minted Afrofuturistic tale with her classmates, most of whom oohed and awed and then went back to the business of being second graders. But there was one little girl who had an issue. A little white girl insisted that it was unfair that my niece wrote a book absent of white characters. So my niece added a white character. She insisted that it was unfair that her avatar was given less words than the black and brown avatars. So my niece amplified her voice. She insisted that it was unfair that her character did not possess major superpowers. So my niece augmented her powers. She insisted that it was unfair that she wasn't also saving people. So my niece made her a sidekick. At this point, we intervened. An age-appropriate conversation on the hostility, racism, and misogyny war that awaited my niece outside the safety of our homes had already taken place. But now we had to prepare her for the ways in which Black women are systematically erased. Using the language of fairness, the little white girl had convinced my niece that she had committed a great wrong. Of course she had not. What she did was have the audacity to be the unit of her own imagination. Though merely a child, the little white girl sat comfortably in her privilege and had already internalized the belief that her place in the world was central and secure. As global Black people, we are not permitted to see ourselves as the unit of anyone's imagination, not even our own. There is a pervasive reoccurring narrative that tells us we cannot see ourselves in a world of our own making, that we can't imagine ourselves to be the heroes of our own stories. Belle Saves the World illustrates how early and often that narrative gets told. This presentation is interested in exploring what happens when Black women use their superpowers to save themselves rather than the world. Rebelliously, Afrofuturism contests these narratives of erasure and any demand that we decenter Black lives, Black experiences, and Black cultures. Afrofuturism insists unquestioningly that we are central, that we will remain the unit of our imagination. In the interest of time, I have to be selective and concise with my articulation of Afrofuturism. There's a lot of people I would love to bring in, but suffice it to say that broadly speaking, Afrofuturism is a genre of literature, art, music, and film that takes up science fiction elements to narrate Black lives, cultures, histories, and futures. More precisely, it contests ideas about science, technology, and knowledge by putting Blackness at its center. Many Afrofuturistic texts do not fit seamlessly within the genre of science fiction and may borrow from other speculative genres, such as fantasy, magical realism, noir, and horror. Contemporarily speaking, we see Afrofuturism in music by Erykah Badu, Janelle Monáe, and Solange, in movies like Black Panther and See You Yesterday, as well as in the works by visual artists like Alicia Wormsley and Colleen Smith. Tegan Bristow calls Afrofuturism, quote, a necessary re-identification outside of the dominant racial stereotype. My presentation offers a similar intervention. I love this definition because it gets at the heart of what we're all interested in, and that is Black people's humanity. Akin to Dwight Douglas Kilgore, I also think of Afrofuturism as a movement involving consciousness, culture, and identity that deploys technology in order to shift people's perspectives on what it means to be Black, right? Because Black is not a monolithic identity. In the present and in the future, Afrofuturism makes us consider those unthought assumptions regarding which histories matters. And really, when we say histories, what we mean are stories, because history is nothing but well-cultivated, preserved, and reified stories. I am also inspired by Nandia Okorafor's definition of African futurism, which privileges Black voices and reminds us that the future is largely rooted in the past. I would venture to say that Africa is the future because the entire modern Western world is built upon its past and our very existence relies upon its present. Let me repeat that. Africa is the future. The entire modern Western world is built upon its past, and our very existence relies upon its present. As you can see, I am using Hippolyta in Lovecraft Country through what I'm calling a diasporic futuristic lens. One of my favorite scholars, Omasiki Natasha Tinsley, once invited readers of her book to read it like a song. In that same spirit, I would like to invite the audience to receive this presentation as a hieroglyphic. Hieroglyphics can be read in a number of complex, some would even say infuriatingly complex ways. But for our purpose, we will stick to the basic formula of reading toward the figure facing gaze. If a symbol or symbols are appearing on whatever text, you look for a figure or a face. If the figure or face is facing left, then you begin reading for the left and you read toward that figure or face. So in fact, the figure or face directs you where to go first and how to read. But what happens when the figure or the face is pointed outward toward us, the audience? The only logical answer is that we must begin our reading from our own reality, from our own positionality. The theme of this speaker series is Afrofuturism, from the screen to reality, Black woman as superhero. To this end, I'll explore the iconography of Hippolyta and see what knowledge she imparts. Because for most Black people, the reality is the resistance. So what do I mean when I say the reality is the resistance? Well, Caribbean poet and scholar Opal Palmer Adisa has a story, or what I'm calling a story, called Stop Crying Wolf. And I think this story best encapsulates the reality of resistance that I'm evoking here tonight. Palmer Adisa writes, "This is the reality I have to face, and women and people of color must come to recognize that the wolf no longer appears dangerous or threatening. The wolf no longer comes prowling out of the forest, teeth gleaming and bared. The wolf is a chameleon, a magician, who often smiles with us, nods his head in agreement, applauds our efforts, tells us what a long way we have come, then sets us up. The wolf is often a man, but not always. The wolf is the socio-political system that regulates and directs our life. The wolf is deadlier than ever and much harder to smoke out. So why do I persist in declaring my Blackness, my femaleness? I should have learned by now not to cry wolf, even when the wolf is stalking me. Don't cry until he attacks. Then, if I have the opportunity, scream for help. Others will come to my aid and applaud my bravery. But why should I wait? I know a proverb that says, prevention is better than having to cure. I do not want to be maimed anymore. I have too many scars that design my body. I want no more." We first meet Hippolyta lying in bed, smiling, with her eyes closed. Her first words are a question. "What are you looking at?" And there is a brief pause before she says the name George. It is this pause that interests me most. There's a breath of uncertainty that is reflective of Hippolyta's journey into naming. Absent a gaze, as her eyes stay closed for the duration of this question, the audience is left to ponder what she is thinking. People often look down when they are in deep thought, and from a certain angle, their eyes can appear closed. So this question of what are you looking at is not solely for George, but also for us, the viewers. When we gaze upon African descendant women, what exactly are we looking at? And are we looking or are we seeing? Because those are two different things. This question lingers for the next 6 episodes before we are afforded an answer. However, this glyph that I'm presenting here provides a bit of foreshadowing. Hippolyta is wearing a white nightgown. In West African cultures, like Nigerian, white may signify the spirit world, chiefly associated with the Orisha Obatala, a masculine deity of purity and creation. This foreshadowing becomes all the more significant in episode 7, titled I Am, where Hippolyta more explicitly becomes a creator. In this moment, she reminds George that she has written more travel logs than has he. So Hippolyta first names herself writer. And in true Afrofuturistic fashion, I ask, what is writing but an act of creation? Thus, in the opening moments of Lovecraft Country, when we are first introduced to Hippolyta, we find evidence of a preoccupation with African iconography and epistemologies. This scene is from the museum, the Boston Museum moment. As we read this moment in the museum as a hieroglyphic, we are directed to start reading with Diana, because if you look at Hippolyta's face, right, she's facing to the right toward her daughter Dee, so that's where we start. Directed toward yet another of her creation, her daughter Diana, whom she births not once as an infant, but also a second time when she returns from the future with an artificial arm, essentially making Dee a cyborg and her mother, the mother of robotics. After telling the story of being denied her truthful place as winner of a scientific competition, Hippolyta says of Hera's chariot, quote, "They didn't want a little colored girl to be the face of their competition," end quote. Not only is Hippolyta completely erased from the history books, but her scientific knowledge and ability goes both unacknowledged and untapped. As they gaze longingly at the stars, the air is heavy with what could have been. Such longings are answered in part by Solange in her 2017 letter to my teenage self, when she pens, quote, "There will be constellations you want to reach for, but you can't put your finger on. You will trace them like scars on your body. You will take the long way to get to these Orions. The long way will become a theme in your life, but a journey you will learn to love," end quote. Is this not Hippolyta's path? After Dee has gently admonished her mother for not fighting this injustice, she enthusiastically yells out, "Y'all see that comet? My mama named it. My mama named Hera's chariot. Now they know the truth too." And just like that, Dee tells us what many of us already knew, and that is, Black women be knowing. As I argue elsewhere, it is in this moment when Dee yells out the name of Hippolyta's comet that her mother comes to understand. We, Black women, possess the power to transform our dreams into lived realities, and we determine the contours of our own bright, beautiful, and commanding constellations. This is the moment the audience realized, from here on out, yo, it's on. Now, at this juncture, I'm sure there are those of you who have noticed my pronunciation has been Hippolyta rather than Hippolyta. The slippage is intentional. When I say her name in this way, one of the things that I am doing is similar to Misha Green. I am troubling the presence of Europe in African history. I'm sure it is not lost on many of you that Hera is the Amazon queen of Greek mythology. And in the Marvel comic universe, the MCU, she is the woman who raises and trains Wonder Woman, whose name happens to be Diana. The presence of these Greek names challenges us to look more deeply at the ways in which African epistemologies, especially scientific and mathematic contributions, have been erased. For example, at least in my childhood, perhaps this is no longer the case, but when I was growing up, when people would invoke Timbuktu, at least in the West, it is used as some cosmic joke to describe how far away something or someone might be. But in reality, it was an epicenter of knowledge, a renowned place of learning with incredible libraries and great scholars, including astronomers. People from all over the world would come there to study, including scholars from Greece. Again, we are faced with the question of which history matters. At least for me, I didn't learn about this history until I was well into my graduate studies. So when Hippolyta deciphers the Ori that is pictured there, it is not surprising because she has already deciphered the stars as a child. Moreover, she comes from a legacy of star readers, not stargazers, but star readers. Once again, Lovecraft Country's preoccupation with African iconographies and epistemologies come to the fore, this time in terms of African cosmologies. According to Kenyan scholar Matthew Karangi, African cosmology is instrumental to the very fabric, right, and life of specific African cultures. It's worth quoting him at length here because what he has to say is so incredibly powerful and important. African cosmology helps one to understand the present situation by revisiting the past. In doing so, one can understand the past, present, and predict the future. This is possible within the traditional cosmology because one experiences the power of relationships, especially with God, the creator, lesser deities, ancestors, and other members of society. That is the cosmology, with God, the creator, lesser deities, ancestors, and other members of society. Put simply, African cosmology is the way Africans perceive, conceive, and contemplate their universe, the lens through which they see reality, which affects their value system and attitudinal orientations. African cosmology is strongly anchored on complex but necessary affiliations between God, their creator, lesser deities, ancestors, or the living dead and living members of the family and community. In the African world, there is a willingness for both God and people to dialogue and share. This interaction and interconnectedness helps cement a community of reciprocity. It is a world in which humans are ontologically related to God, among themselves, and the universe as a whole. End quote. One can and should argue that Hippolyta is part of this dialogue as she lingers between life and death, the natural and the supernatural, space and time, the born and unborn, the living and kinda not living on a number of occasions throughout this series, but especially in episode 7. Though Lovecraft Country plays with temporality and spatiality, for the most part, its reality is set in the 1950s. And then the moon landing happens in 1969. So I'm wondering what is happening in that decade or so in between? What are Black women up to in the space in between? Now, due to Hidden Figures, both the book and the movie, it has become public knowledge that Katherine Johnson's genius is largely responsible for the moon landing. And in 1987, when Mae Jemison became the first Black woman in space that we know of, it was well documented. But we still do not know or say the names of women like Yvonne Clarke, who was the first Black woman to earn a degree in mechanical engineering from Howard University, and then later a master's in engineering from Vanderbilt. And it is even more difficult to unearth African women's scientific contributions, right? Very hard to uncover. Women like Grace L.A. Williams, who earned a PhD in mathematics at the University of Chicago in 1963, did this work in the very city Lovecraft Country is set in, and obtained this degree right smack dab in the middle of what is happening with Hippolyta and the landing on the moon. And then we have Felicia Ogunsheyi, who earned a master's in 1962 from Simmons College in Massachusetts. She later became vice chancellor at a university in Benin. Benin is featured prominently in Lovecraft Country, especially in episode 7, and we're going to visit that momentarily. But again, we do not know, nor do we say these women's names. By evoking them here this evening, I want to remind us that, again, the reality is in the resistance. As Hippolyta seeks out a world where she can name herself anything, I offer these glyphs as an opportunity to explore what that naming process might look like. Again, if we are to read it like a hieroglyph, we start at the far right and read those 2 panels. And when they're stacked, you always start with the image on top. And so that's what we'll do. The time machine is a gateway into other dimensions. Yes, that's very, very clear. But it is also a gateway home to her roots, in this particular case, in Africa, where a different life is possible. But in order to access that possibility, she has to solve the equation. It is also worth noting, all of this happens, or at least most of this happens off planet, as if to say Earth isn't big enough to hold Hippolyta's true name. Recall, right before she returns back to Earth, she asks the being I am, how can I fit everything that I am now into that place? Dropping down and reading the image below, the lower right corner, the lower right panel. Initially, I found Hippolyta's time in the unidentified holding room quite compelling. I think most of us read this as a prison cell, or at least some sort of holding unit, holding containment unit. But I am tells her she is not a prisoner. So my interpretation shifts, and I read this room more like a womb, a place where naming herself is tantamount to giving birth. This scene is reminiscent of a West African tradition where the story goes, and I say the story goes because I have uncovered different versions of this tradition, so I'm just going to tell you the one that I like the most. The story goes that the Akan people of Ghana refrain from naming newborn infants and keep them secluded for the first 8 days of life. Once the allotted time has passed and the community is confident of the child's survival, only then is the newborn presented to the community and their name revealed publicly. I speculate something similar is occurring with Hippolyta. In the interest of time, I'll stop here with that interpretation. However, there's a great deal to unpack in the 4 glyphs presented here, and I do that elsewhere. I said we'd come back to present day Dahomey, and here we are. Present day Benin, historical Dahomey, here we are. Dahomey Amazon were frontline soldiers in the army of the Kingdom of Dahomey, a West African empire that existed from 1625 to about 1894. This glyph tells us that these women warriors of Benin are rarely called by their name and often referred to as the African Amazons, which is what the Europeans whom they fought misnamed them. While they are often called the Dahomey Amazon, the African Amazon, some form of Amazon, their fawn name, according to Flora McDonald, is Nino, which translates to our mother or witch. And which is a really poor translation because the nuances of spiritual power gets lost in the negative Western connotations associated with that word. Misnaming, renaming, unnaming, and a refusal to say their true name is all part of Hippolyta's journey into being, where so much of her reality is resistance to erasure. I also want to mention that an integral part of this legend, or the Dahomey cultural legend, is that of a male and female god who come together to create the universe. This kind of religious iconography takes me back to my earlier reading of Hippolyta as Abatala, and this kind of play on gender, and how naming isn't merely about a title or how one is called, but more importantly, about becoming or creating. As for the warriors themselves, the Minnow used clubs, musket, and machetes, all of which you see in the glyphs presented here, to inflict death on their enemies. Other visible similarities include the functionality of the cowrie shell as breastplates, and then sometimes they use them for ornamental purposes or adornment, like on bracelets and other things. Gold is often used to denote power and status, something that is reaffirmed when Hippolyta leads them into battle. I'll conclude my thoughts on this glyph by sharing something Hippolyta's general that you see there in the brown tells or cannot tell her, actually. And that is what true freedom is. Given that Hippolyta's last name is Freeman, there is more than a little something in all of this, in both the free and the man. The current Minnow queen that you see pictured here in the left glyph, Queen Hangbi, is a direct descendant of the original Queen Hangbi and claims that all traces of her ancestors' reign were erased by a male relative who later assumed the throne, King Agaja, who believed that only men should hold the throne. She has reclaimed the name and the throne, and according to McDonald's research, her Minnow insists on calling her king, not queen. And there's some power dynamics there, of course. In the larger paper, I go into detail on death, erasure, and the importance of naming. I make linkages between what I presented here on the Minnow and the contemporary Say Her Name movement in order to demonstrate the ways in which African descended women continue to have their lives disavowed. Again, the reality is in the resistance. But that part of my argument will have to wait for another day. You would think like 30, 40, 45 minutes is a long time. It really isn't. Okay, so this slide is largely a gratuitous acknowledgement to say, yes, I am aware there's comparisons to be made between the Dori Malaja and the Black Panther in the Minnow's warriors that I just talked about, and Hippolyta in Lovecraft Country. But I have a couple of more slides, so we're going to keep it moving. I want to direct our attention to the surroundings, right? I mentioned the Benin/Dahomey was featured prominently, and so it is. Dahomey, the existence of the Dahomey culture debunks notions that Africa had no great civilization. As told by historian Robin Law, Dahomey was heavily involved in international commerce. It had commercialized domestic economies, transactional monetized systems through the cowrie shell and other forms. And it exercised a great deal of control over the trade with Europeans, right? There's this myth that Europe just absolutely dominated the continent of Africa, and that simply isn't true. The city was well organized, very well governed, and they, like China, also had engineering marvels such as a Great Wall, and I got money that said a woman built it. So let's take a little close up at these particular slides. So the building picture here is shaped like one of the ancient palaces. The animals that adorn it would also adorn the Minnow/Dahomey queen's artifacts. Even contemporarily speaking, the queen that I just showed you, some of her umbrellas and other artifacts are adorned with similar images of these animals. I find it thought-provoking that this is the backdrop to Hippolyta's naming herself. It seems her Minnow Amazonian name is not just something she carries, but is literally written into the city. Its building, its people, its culture, its very fabric. So as the French soldiers advance and the background goes out of focus and Hippolyta comes sharply into focus, on her face we can see the exhaustion, not only from this particular battle, but also due to the journey she is on. Unlike the moment when she says with power and determination earlier in the episode when she's dancing with Josephine Baker, she screams her name with great conviction. In this moment, she rather quietly, even tepidly, calls herself Hippolyta, pause, George's wife. It is anticlimactic and I am left confused and a wee bit disappointed. Hippolyta's identity crisis reached its climax, and I'm left wondering, has she, in this newly returned to present state, named herself wife and by extension mother? Will her journey end where it all began? Most importantly, what does it all mean? And we are immediately transported back to the present. Right when she says her name, this is where we land. We return to that moment from episode 1, where she is in bed with George, or so it seems. Akin to my slippage of tongue in vacillating between Hippolyta and Hippolyta, here Lovecraft Country has a visual slippage of its own. We think we are back at that moment from episode 1. And the slide that I showed you used to introduce Hippolyta exactly that. This is that slide. It's just cropped, right? A close-up of her face. But it's not the same moment. A closer reading reveals clues that we have moved from Western time into African cosmology. First, when we snap back, Hippolyta's eyes are wide open. Second, George may or may not be dead, but he is present, indicating this may or may not be an alternative reality, but a reality nonetheless. So, like the woman who refused to allow the wolf to eat her, Hippolyta refuses to be consumed by anger, challenging those stereotypes I mentioned earlier. Naming the thing that's been eating at her, as Hippolyta describes it, releases her from the limitations of this world. Provocatively, it doesn't simply lift the veil from her eyes or even the audience's eyes, but also from George's, who now doesn't just look at her, but actually sees her and says he sees her. And with the heretofore unforeseen or unseen force, Hippolyta bellows, "I am Hippolyta, discoverer." Not just discoverer of words, I would argue, but a namer of self. And I'll conclude with these final thoughts. At a recent Afrofuturism symposium, in her keynote address, Nalo Hopkinson talked about the difficulties of writing into your future. This presentation, like my 7-year-old niece's Afrofuturistic comic book, has allowed me to take on that challenge, to defy the odds, to ignore the naysayers, and to write myself into the future, and to forever be the unit of my imagination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace. My good, like I have a notepad. I've just been like, boop, boop, boop. And can I say from my notes, I was looking at all of the books I hadn't read, and Belle Saves the World is now on the list. So let me know when that becomes available, how we all can see it. It's fantastic. I want to use this moment to fast forward us a little bit to our After Effects session. And so this is just a moment in time for you and our moderator, Dr. Finney Coleman, to have a moment together to kind of see if there's anything that you all want to discuss that maybe wasn't able to be caught right away in the presentation, or any questions that Dr. Coleman may have that would be pertinent to the group. So I'll let y'all have it.
Thank you for that, Shauna. Give it up again for, I mean, virtually. How do you do that with the hand? Wonderful presentation, Belinda. Really enjoyed that. Very insightful. I mean, I have 3 questions that I kind of want to ask, but I also want to give people who may have questions. Go ahead. If you have a question, go ahead and type that into the chat. Hopefully I can see those. But while we're waiting for people to formulate other questions that we might answer, you ended with this really provocative kind of statement about the difference between looking versus seeing. And I wonder if you want to say anything more about the difference between those two things.
I think with looking, it's a much more passive engagement, right? I don't want to get too much into like scopophilia or the gaze, but I think seeing requires a certain level of consciousness and engagement, a certain curiosity and questioning that demands that you interact with what it is you're encountering visually, right? So your mind is stimulated, your emotions are stimulated. You're not just passively looking at something or even passively watching something. So I think for me, the biggest difference is that seeing is an active understanding of what you're encountering, And looking is just a visual acknowledgement that something is there.
Wonderful. You know, I wonder about if you were writing the next season, if there was going to be a season, what would you do with Hippolyta? How would you treat that character? Where would you go with her? What would you like to see done?
You see, I think with Hippolyta, what is done is done. I would actually choose Ruby as my next superhero, quite frankly. I know she's dead, so the first thing I do is bring her back to life. And then I would move forward in her exploration, because I think there's a lot to unpack as a darker skinned Black woman, as a fuller figure Black woman, as an educated Black woman who can't get on, right? She has just so much to offer in this world that I think the possibilities for her are boundless. So if we were to take her out of Chicago, because I don't think out of all the female characters we've seen in Lovecraft Country, I believe she's the only character who is rooted in Chicago. She never leaves. And so I would take her out of Chicago and see what she has to offer. So that would be my next superhero in Lovecraft Country. It would be Ruby, because I just think that character is brilliant and deserves so much more attention.
So I should, you know, take a chance to recognize my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Kimberly Brown, who is here. I didn't see her. I didn't see her when we first started, but she's with us too, and she'll be here, I believe, next week to talk about Regina King and Watchmen and other things. You know, I wonder, you know, and maybe you can help me to formulate the question that I'm after here. It has to do with misreading Afrofuturism as kind of the obverse somehow of white supremacy, as a response to whiteness, as opposed to being its own thing, generative thing. And I don't know if Dr. Mays or if Dr. Brown you know, would like to chime in, but Belinda, could you talk about that? Or maybe I have the question improperly formed, but it seems to me that Afrofuturism is not merely Black people trying to construct a space because white folk have been mean to them.
No, and I hope my presentation didn't give that impression. I think it's a much more fuller picture, and that is why I brought in Afrofuturism in the Kilgore definition that I use, because it challenges us to look at Blackness not as a monolith, and it challenges us to center Blackness not in a response to whiteness. And that is what I love about Okorafor's definition of African futurism, is that she privileges the works that are created by African descended people, but she also privileges looking at what has been. There is no longing for what is lost, because she says we have so much that we've produced on the continent as well as in the diaspora. And so I think there's a tendency to go into a direction of like hyper resistance. Everything we do as Black people is to counter white supremacy, or hyper romanticization, right? Where everything we do as Black people is just the greatest thing ever because we're Black. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for our humanity. And so what I did with my presentation is to highlight that humanity, right? But if we're going from the screen into our reality, we still have to acknowledge that our reality is dealing with white supremacy. That's not the only reality. We can't be limited to that, but it would be naive to say that we can have an existence in this United States of America as it is currently constituted outside of that. Wow. So yes, we are a lot more than our stories of oppression and struggle, right? And in case you're wondering what happened to Belle, Belle is thriving. She's doing great, saving the world. But if Dr. Brown or Dr. Mays would like to jump in and add to that, please do.
I'd like to say a few words about, in agreement with you, Dr. Wallace. Afrofuturism is certainly not a response, and I don't in any way perceive that your presentation indicated that. I don't, as a primary function of African or African descended expression, right? That is a part of it because we're talking about systemic and structural conditions that shape one's material being. But, you know, being originary in Black imagination, being originary in Black aspiration, being originary in Black survivance. I mean, these are, you know, not only survivance, but thrivance. These are the preoccupations that the work that I, you know, see in Octavia Butler and I see in Janelle Monáe being, right? A testament, an affirmation, and a recognition, and a particular kind of, as you say, seeing, right, of who we are and what the possibilities are for us. Despite, not in reaction to, but despite the structures that shape our reality.
Absolutely. And this is why I brought in Solange, because I think Solange talks to Janelle in a lot of ways, right? Where that quote about constellations, right? And filling out our own contours speaks to that very moment. And so yes, absolutely, Dr. Mace.
Wonderful. I don't know if Dr. Brown is she still with us?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
But I'm hanging back in the cut. So I'm going to yield the floor to everyone else who might have some questions. I'm not viewable at the moment. So, you know, but this has really been an interesting presentation. Belinda, you're going to be a hard act to follow.
Oh, well, thank you. You're too kind, Dr. Brown.
Well, you know, we're up against the hour. There's a great question out there from Steve Bishop about the naming of Hippolyta. But we don't have time to get to it because unfortunately we have some closing announcements that we have to get in under the 5 o'clock mark. So Steve, hopefully you'll come back and we can maybe jump on that question in some way or another the next time out. So Shauna, thank you so much for this opportunity, and please sign us off.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. Thank